Chapter 049 Substitution. Time travel was a hard thing to prove. It was known to be impossible among mages, and proof to the contrary usually boiled down to possession of impossible knowledge and skills. Unfortunately, that often simply wasn't convincing enough. There existed a nigh infinite number of ways to gather information with magic, none of which required time travel, and impossible skills could just as easily mean you were not who you claimed you were. There was little that Zorian could tell Xveen that couldn't be explained with something more mundane than time travel. Still, while Zorian had no idea whether Xveen was actually going to accept his story, he was confident that the information he'd written down on the sheet of paper in front of him would at least give the man some pause. The restarts varied greatly in how they developed, but some things always remained the same, which meant that Zorian could give Xveen a multitude of small predictions about the upcoming days. Things like what was going to be written in the newspapers, what magical stores would announce special sales in preparation for the summer festival, and what students would end up leaving the academy because of the monster incursions. It helped that it had been less than a week since the restart had begun, so events didn't have the time to diverge too much yet. Individually, each of the things he'd written were easy to explain. When taken as a whole, he would have to be the best damn spy in the whole city to acquire that kind of information, and it still wouldn't explain how he'd known about some of the more sudden events on the list. He handed the list to Xveen, who quickly scanned it and then pocketed it with a silent nod. He told Zorian that he would try to verify his claims over the weekend and that Zorian should visit him again on Monday. And that was that. A decent outcome, all things considered. Zorian halfway expected Xveen to criticize his penmanship and tell him to start over and write properly this time around. He bid Xveen goodbye and left. He was in the process of walking back home, idly trying to think of a good way to broach the topic of Sadamir's soul well to Kale, when he spotted a green-haired girl waving at him in the distance. Surprised and distracted as he was, it took him several seconds to realize who he was looking at, even though green hair was pretty damn rare and therefore a huge giveaway. It was Capriva Reed, one of his classmates. He waved back uncertainly, wondering what that was about. It was common courtesy to greet your classmates when you meet them outside the academy, of course, but this wasn't the first time Zorian had encountered Capriva outside the academy, and she had never reacted like this in the past. She'd give him a nod if they passed each other by or say hello if he did it first, but never try to attract his attention like she just had. Which made sense, really. She was almost a total stranger to him, just like most of his classmates. So why was she? Oh. Never mind, he was going to find out what she wanted soon enough. She was crossing the street and making a beeline towards him. Zorian studied her as she approached, trying to see if he was in some kind of trouble. He felt no hostility or apprehension emanating from her, so probably not, but Capriva always kind of intimidated him. Less so since he got stuck in the time loop. Before he used to actively avoid her whenever possible, but even in his current situation he'd rather not tangle with someone from House Reed. He was still vulnerable to being drugged senseless, and that was kind of their specialty. He clearly wasn't the only one who found her intimidating, either. She was a tall, shapely girl, something Zorian could attest to at the moment, what with her getting ever closer to his position, but very few people had tried to court her over the years. Even Benisek refrained from making a pass on her, which was pretty damn amazing. Zorian was pretty sure that Akoya was the only other girl in their class who Benisek had never tried to flirt with. "Zorian, you can't believe how glad I am to see you here," she said once she had finally gotten close enough. He raised his eyebrows at the statement. "You live together with Kale, right?" "Yes," he confirmed, curious what that had to do with anything. "Good. I agreed to meet with him about a business deal today and he gave me the directions to this Imayu's place where you two live, but I seem to be misremembering something because I can't find it," she said. "Could you give me some directions here? I can do better. I'm on my way there myself, so if you don't mind I can just walk you there," he said. "Great. I was hoping you would say that," she grinned at him. "Lead the way, then. And don't mention to anyone that I got lost, okay?" That was pretty freaking embarrassing. I don't know how I messed up so badly. If Kale asks, we just met on the way by accident. Kind of true, anyway. Zorian nodded in acceptance and they both set off towards Imaya's place. He couldn't help but frown at Kopriva slightly, though. Business deal. Was this what he thought it was? Unfortunately, Kopriva noticed the look and misconstrued its meaning. What's that look for? She asked defensively. You don't approve of me coming to your place or something? It's not like that, Zorian assured her hurriedly. Man, she was prickly. It's just that when Kale told me he was going to find someone to buy those rare alchemical ingredients from, I didn't expect this to be the result. I thought he would go to someone, well, older. When Kale had told Zorian that he had to get a hold of a fair amount of normally restricted alchemical ingredients to continue with his research, Zorian had thought the Morlock would go to some shady shop or something, not try to broker a deal with one of their classmates. Then again, Zorian had to admit that the idea wasn't stupid as such. House Reed, of which Kopriva was a member, specialized in growing magical plants and processing them into alchemical ingredients. It was also a public secret that they were heavily involved in the sale of drugs and illegal alchemy products in general, and through that maintained deep links with organized crime groups. There was a highly publicized trial against the house a few years back, since several smuggling rings were found to be led by exiled members of the house, but nothing came out of it in the end. House Reed was responsible for a sizable proportion of Eldamar's herb fields, greenhouses and forest preserves, some of which nobody except House Reed knew how to tend to, so the government wasn't willing to antagonize them too much. So yes, there was some logic to Kale approaching Kopriva to acquire the needed ingredients, though Zorian was still very surprised it had worked. He would have expected Kopriva to act outraged at the implication that she was engaged in criminal activities, fearing some kind of trick. That's what Zorian would have done in her place. He would have to ask Kale how he had done it later, just in case there was some secret to it that he should know about. He did intend to make use of criminal networks himself in the near future, after all. Wait, you're in on that? She asked, surprised. Yeah. We're in a partnership of sorts, Zorian said. Huh? She said, giving him a speculative look. I would have never guessed you were involved in something like this. You just seem so straight-laced, you know? Then again, you're a pretty driven guy, and my grandfather always said that nobody ever got powerful by following the law. Such sage wisdom from the older generation. To tell the truth, I would have never guessed you'd be involved in something like this, either, Zorian said. I mean, weren't you annoyed when Kale approached you about this? Doesn't it bother you that one of your fellow students automatically assumed you were involved in your family's other business simply because you're part of House Reed? She snorted derisively. Everyone assumes that anyway, she said. They are just too polite to say it out loud. At least most of the time. Besides, I made some uncharitable assumptions about him as well. I wouldn't have acknowledged any random offer, you know? If you had been the one to approach me, I would have told you to go to hell. And possibly punched you, if you didn't back off after that. But since Kale is a Morlock, I assume this offer is actually genuine. Morlocks have a reputation of their own, you know. Ah. So that's why it had worked so easily. Kopriva then tried to talk him into telling her what he and Kale needed so much restricted material for and how they had gotten the money to pay for it. Zorian actually answered the first, saying it was for benign medical research. Totally true, unless Kale was misleading him, but refused to answer questions about the money. He took the chance to ask her if she was planning on reporting them to someone, reading her surface thoughts to make sure she was telling the truth. She denied that, truthfully, as far as he could tell, and seemed more amused than insulted by the accusation. She didn't really believe they wanted the materials for medical research, though. Zorian didn't bother convincing her he was telling the truth. After that, the conversation shifted to other, more casual topics. Mostly academy-related, as that was a relatively inoffensive subject, but Kopriva sometimes pried into his private life when she saw a convenient opportunity to do so. It was interesting, as she hadn't been this talkative in the previous restarts when she'd joined this combat magic group. Eventually they reached their destination, at which point Kopriva met Amaya. His landlord had either never heard of House Reed or had an even better poker face than Zorian had thought, because she looked positively overjoyed about Kopriva's visit. She insisted that Zorian was rude not to offer Kopriva something to eat and drink before dragging her away to hash out a deal. "Food before work," Amaya said in a lecturing voice. "That's the rule." Since Kopriva seemed actually excited at the prospect of eating some homemade cookies, Zorian went along with it. He wasn't in that much of a hurry. He really shouldn't have been surprised when Kopriva asked Amaya for a glass of beer, or when Amaya gave them both a glass in response. He covertly transmuted the liquid into something non-alcoholic while they weren't looking, but that just made the stuff taste even viler than it usually did, so he may have shot himself in the foot there. In the end, while the deal was successfully concluded, what was supposed to be a relatively short visit ended up taking most of the afternoon. Kopriva even ended up meeting Kirill, with whom she got along surprisingly well. He would have to talk to his sister later about what was acceptable for conversation around the green-haired girl, since Kopriva said she would drop by again next week to deliver the materials. He should probably have a talk with Amaya as well, just in case the older woman really had no idea who she was dealing with. Ultimately, though, Zorian did not worry about the whole thing too much. The deal was largely arranged by Kale, for Kale, with Zorian's role being mainly to pay for it all. As such, he felt it was only proper to let the Morlock boy take care of it while Zorian focused on something else. Gods knew he had too many things vying for his time as it was. Break. Zorian's plan for the weekend consisted of 2 solid days of Arania fighting and accompanying memory reading to practice for the eventual opening of the Matriarch's memory packet. Sadly, the plan didn't survive collision with reality. His first target, the burning apex web in the vicinity of Seoria, turned out to be a rather poor choice for aggression. They were a martially inclined web, proficient in both magic and mental combat, and had spent most of their existence in fierce competition with the neighboring webs. The patrol he ambushed seemed like easy targets to him, but they ended up being anything but. They worked together flawlessly, had some sort of mental attack that could partially pass through his mental barriers, and had prepared the battlefield beforehand. They ended up maneuvering him into a pre-existing explosion trap and detonated a boulder right next to him. He managed to shield himself against the bulk of the blast, but he still ended up with a severely wounded arm and a multitude of minor scrapes. Plus he had a raging headache from when he failed to shield against their telepathic attacks properly. He activated his recall stone and fled. The damage was nothing really serious, he later found out, but it would take several days before he was completely healed, even with the healing potions that Kale was supplying him. Since embarking on further campaigns against the Aranya while in less than top form struck him as a terrible idea, his plans would have to be delayed. Damn it. At least Kale was happy. Ever since he had found out that Zorian could teleport all over the country as he pleased, he had been trying to talk Zorian into taking him to the northern wilderness so he could gather herbs, mushrooms and other materials for his research. Zorian had been decidedly against it, considering it to be a waste of time. But since his plan was already shot to hell and he couldn't do much at the moment, he figured he would grant Kale's wish just this once. Accordingly, Sunday found Zorian wandering around the forest with Kale. Zorian had expected his role would be to simply teleport Kale around and protect him from anything that sought to kill them, but Kale was feeling talkative that day and insisted on explaining everything he was doing to Zorian. Every time they encountered one of the plants Kale was looking for, the Morlock boy told him why the plant could be found in that particular place, what it was useful for, and how to harvest the plant correctly. All of which was very important information that was not easy to get a hold of. One could not find this sort of thing in most books, as people were reluctant to share this sort of information. It was all too easy to overharvest specific magical plants if too many people were doing it, so there was a tendency among herbalists to guard their secrets tightly and only pass them on to their apprentices. Even so, quite a few magical plants went totally extinct over the centuries due to unchecked exploitation, making potions they were used for impossible to make in modern times. So yes, it was a good thing to know all this. And yet, I still don't see why you wanted to do this so badly, Zorian complained as he used a knife to harvest some sort of river grass. The thing was tricky to harvest correctly, since one had to cut it quickly and in exactly the right place, or its alchemical properties would be completely ruined. Not an easy thing to do with one wounded hand. We could have just bought all of this in a store and saved ourselves so much time. Yes, I know it would have been rather expensive, but I could afford it. Easily. Money is less of a problem for me than time. I'm afraid you are wrong, Kale said, shaking his head. The Morlock boy was crouching not too far from Zorian, staring at a large boulder like it was the most interesting thing in the world. Zorian felt the urge to ask Kale what the hell was so interesting about that rock, but eventually decided he didn't want to know. The things we are gathering are very hard to find in a store. They tend to be snapped up by wealthy, influential alchemists who buy them straight from the people who gather them in the wild. They never reach the shelves. Really? Zorian asked, surprised. Strange. You'd think someone would just start cultivating them if they're in such high demand. You know, like House Reed and so many others are already doing for other useful magical plants. Not every plant can be grown in controlled conditions, Kale told him. Many of them cannot survive outside their natural environment for whatever reason, and that environment is either impossible or uneconomical to mimic artificially. Others will grow just fine, but will lose whatever essence makes them useful if not taken care of in just the right way or exposed to very specific conditions. Some of them can be transplanted into gardens and survive, but will never grow or reproduce afterwards. Some of them grow so slowly that nobody can be actually bothered to wait for them to grow to maturity. Okay, I get it, Zorian said, interrupting his lecture. Magical plants are very hard to domesticate. I actually knew that already, but the ones we're gathering just don't seem all that special to me, you know? But if you say otherwise, I will take your word for it. I'm not a botanical expert by any means. Neither am I, but I do know a few things about the topic. My adoptive mother insisted I had to know these things if I wanted to be a real alchemist, Kale said, rising to his feet and discarding the clump of moss he had been scrutinizing up until a moment ago. Are you done with those? Do you need some help? Here, Zorian said, handing Kale the river grass he harvested. I think I got all of them correctly, but you should probably check to make sure. Kale glanced at the small bundle in Zorian's hands and immediately discarded 3 of the stalks that Zorian had apparently ruined without realizing it. How Kale could recognize that on first sight, Zorian had no idea. We're done here, I think, Kale said, looking around for a second. I don't think we'll find anything else here without a lot of walking around. Do you think you can teleport us to the next section of the forest now? Sure. My mana reserves were replenished a while ago, Zorian said. Let's go then. Deeper into the wilderness this time around. We haven't been attacked by anything truly dangerous the entire day, and I want to see if I can find some ghost ivy or moonflowers, Kale said, gesturing northward. Zorian nodded, unperturbed by the somewhat increased danger. While there were quite a few creatures that could kill them that deep in the forest, he should be able to notice them in time and teleport them to safety. A minute later they popped over to their new destination, and Kale started looking around to assess their surroundings. Teleporting is so very convenient, the white-haired boy commented. I can't wait to learn how to do that. How long do you think it would take me to learn how to teleport like that? I don't know. A year or 2? Zorian speculated. If you work hard on your shaping skills, that is. As little as a couple of months if you work with me to create a training regimen for you like I'm doing for Taven. Ha! I might take you up on it at some point, he said. I'm wasting a lot of your time and nerves as it is, though, and I don't want to be greedy. You've been a lot of help over the restarts, Zorian assured him. You've earned some consideration from me, as far as I'm concerned. I see, Kale said speculatively. In that case, I'd like to pester you a little about those disappearances happening around Nyazov Valley. Many of these people had been my friends and acquaintances, and their fate rests rather heavily on my mind. I know you have been busy in these past few restarts, but did you perhaps look into the matter at some point? Well, he hadn't planned on having this talk during this particular outing, but he supposed this was as good a moment as any to tell Kale about Sadamir's soul trap thingy. Actually, about that break, Zorian had fully expected Kale to freak out when he heard what Sadamir was doing in his isolated forest mansion, and he was not disappointed in that regard. If anything, Zorian greatly underestimated how furious the moral boy would be by the end of the story. Kale, in a rather stunning display of recklessness, wanted them to go visit Iasku Mansion immediately so he could inspect Sadamir's soul trap. It took almost an hour for Zorian to convince the other boy that this was a spectacularly bad idea. Zorian was still wounded, Kale was not thinking straight, and neither of them had done any preparations for such an expedition. "You realize what this means, right?" Kale asked him. It was apparently a rhetorical question because Kale immediately answered it himself. Every one of those times you died during the invasion, your soul was likely sucked into that thing along with everyone else's. "Yeah, so?" asked Zorian. "The time loop mechanism clearly doesn't care about that. It just plucks my soul out of the pillar and goes on to do its thing like usual." Though now that Zorian thought about it, that in itself might be a clue as to how the time loop really functioned. It could be that the time loop mechanism was just so powerful that it could casually extract his soul out of a giant soul prison that probably had a million safeguards against someone doing that very thing. But it could also be that the way it all worked just sort of sidestepped the problem. If the time loop really destroyed everything whenever it rolled back time, it might not really matter where his soul ended up in the end, so long as it's still intact. Yes, and the collection process is apparently sufficiently benign that you have suffered no soul damage from being exposed to it multiple times, Kale said. That's good to know, at least. It definitely puts some of my fears to rest. But Zorian, I'm honestly not sure how much I can help you with this. When you really get down to it, I'm really just a dabbler in soul magic, and Sadamir is clearly an expert at the field. He has also delved deep into areas of soul magic that I wouldn't have even touched, so even if I were an expert I might not have been of any help. I'll see what I can find out in the next couple of days, but in all likelihood you're going to have to find someone else to help you deal with Sadamir. I don't suppose you have any recommendations? Zorian tried. I already gave you a list of people I know who dabbled in soul magic and, well, Sadamir already got most of them. Kale shook his head sadly. Sorry. Maybe try that warrior priest that Lekave is friends with. He clearly has considerable experience with soul magic and he sounds like he could help. In fact, the priesthood in general might be your best bet. They regularly go after people like Sadamir, and have both the qualified experts and the experience necessary for something like this. I'm pretty sure they won't just dismiss your claims out of hand. They take reports of necromancy very seriously, and your accusations should be easy to prove. Just teleport someone in the vicinity of Iasku Mansion and let them see the evidence themselves. That's an interesting idea. I might actually try that in the next restart, if you really end up being unable to help me in any way, Zorian said. Though I'm worried about that escalating into something huge and attracting Red Robe's attention. Sadamir is connected to the invasion pretty tightly. I don't think the Ebisons would stay secret for long if Iasku Mansion came under attack like that. Honestly, that might actually be a good thing, Kale speculated. Red Robe thinks you are part of an army of time travelers out to get him, right? If so, it might actually be suspicious if you don't periodically do something big like that. Well, maybe, Zorian said. But it's still a huge hint to Red Robe, telling him where to look to find out more about his opposition. I feel it's too dangerous to expose myself to danger like that. After a while, they ran out of ideas to bounce back between each other and uncomfortable silence descended between them. Kale's inability to help much against Sadamir clearly kept eating away at him, gradually worsening his mood, and Zorian didn't know what to say to cheer him up. He doubted Kale even wanted to be cheered up. Eventually, Kale decided to simply cut their expedition short and asked Zorian to teleport them back home. The gathering trip was over. Break, Monday came, and with it his meeting with Xvim. Xvim had never told Zorian when exactly he should drop by for their talk, so Zorian decided to come see him once his classes were over and he had no other obligations. Xvim, as it turned out, had other ideas. The man ended up causing a small stir by barging into Zorian's first class of the day to pick him up, evidently impatient to talk to him. He had no idea whether this was a good or bad thing, and Xvim refused to discuss anything until they were safely seated inside his office. So, Zorian asked, "What's your final verdict?" Instead of answering, Xvim took a palm-sized stone orb out of his drawer and handed it to Zorian. "Channel some mana into this orb," Xvim told him. The moment Zorian did so, the stone sphere lit up in a soft yellow glow. It was very familiar to Zorian. It reminded him of those basic training orbs they were given during their first year at the academy, the ones that helped students learn how to reliably channel their mana into the target. What was the point of making him do something like that again? Wait. Is this thing testing my mana signature? Zorian asked curiously. Yes, Xvim confirmed. Everyone's personal mana is unique. You can hide or change your mana signature, but you cannot mimic someone else's to the best of my knowledge. The most you could do is trick the orb into giving a false positive, but I'd be able to tell if you were tampering with it in that fashion. It seems you really are who you claim you are, Mr. Kaczynski. I expected as much, but it would be sloppy not to check. First it was a lock keyed into my mana signature, and now this. How exactly did the Academy acquire my mana signature? I don't remember giving it at any point, said Zorian, handing the orb back to Xvim. Every time you used one of these training orbs during your first year, said Xvim, waving the stone orb in front of Zorian's face, you were effectively giving the Academy your mana signature. It was just a matter of locking the orb down to preserve it for future use. And it's legal? Zorian frowned. Xvim nodded. Required by law, even. The government likes to have everyone's mana signatures on hand for investigations. It greatly simplifies a lot of identity disputes and the like. Right, Zorian sighed. So now that we've established I'm indeed Zorian Kaczynski. Yes, the time loop problem, Xvim said, putting the orb back into his drawer. I assume you are aware of the prevalent opinion regarding time travel? Zorian nodded. They say it's impossible, he said. I know. But that's theory, and a lot of failed experiments, Xvim interjected. And my personal experiences say otherwise, continued Zorian, ignoring Xvim's interjection. Whatever prevalent opinion says, I can clearly see that time travel is possible. It's just a question of whether I've convinced you I'm telling the truth or not. You've convinced me there is something to your story, at least, Xvim said. But I'm afraid I'm going to need more convincing before I actually accept the idea of a time loop. Do you think you could clarify some things for me? The next hour and a half consisted of Xvim questioning Zorian about the rules that governed the time loop and the events surrounding it. The questioning was detailed enough that Xvim probably realized Zorian was hiding some things from him, but the man never called him out on this. He also never wrote anything down, simply staring at Zorian and listening to his explanations in silence. It was honestly all a little unnerving. The material world has been cut off from the spiritual realms. Xvim asked, raising an eyebrow at him. And you didn't feel this merited an inclusion in that list of things you gave me at the end of our Friday meeting? Well, what would that prove? Zorian defended himself. Nothing about that says specifically time travel. No, but it helps ameliorate one of the major issues that has been bothering me about this scenario, Xvim said, staring at him. Namely, the incredible scale of the event you're describing. You've described the time loop as a cosmic phenomenon. It doesn't just wrench your soul into the past, it literally rolls back time for everything except you and your fellow time travelers. That's an implausible claim. The universe is very big and magic as we understand it has sharp limitations. But if the time loop had to cut off the material realm from the spiritual sphere to do its work, then that means it is somehow limited in scope, And that makes the whole thing a lot more believable to me. Did you speak to an astronomer to see if there were any irregularities in the stars and planetary orbits? No, Zorian frowned. Why do you think there would be irregularities? Because any responsible spell designer tries to minimize the costs of the spell, regardless of how much mana he has at his disposal, Xvim told him. If I was in charge of building a spell that does what you describe, I wouldn't have bothered extending the effect beyond what I absolutely had to. Why burn resources unnecessarily? No one has ever set foot on the other planets, much less the distant stars. You could simply replace the heavens with an illusionary screen and be done with it. Most people would never know the difference. But astronomers might, Zorian guessed. Yes. Especially if the spell originates from the time of the first Ecosian Emperor like you said it might. There were no telescopes back then, and even professional star watchers relied on their eyes to note the changes in the heavens. An illusion good enough to fool them might not be enough to do the same today, Xvim said. I guess it's worth a try, Zorian said dubiously. Though I'm honestly kind of skeptical that we'll go anywhere. I'm pretty sure you can't just isolate our planet from the rest of the celestial bodies without breaking everything horribly and killing us all in the process. There has to be a limit somewhere, Xvim said. I'll talk to the couple of astronomers I know and see what they tell me. In the meantime, make a note somewhere to include the Spirit World Severance factoid in your list the next time you try to convince me that the time loop is real. It should do wonders for your credibility. Also, make sure to sign the list with this. Xvim took out a slip of paper from his pocket and handed it to him. Written on it in neat, perfect writing was a long string of letters and numbers. The whole thing was completely random and nonsensical as far as Zorian could tell. Some kind of coded message? Zorian mused out loud. Something similar. I've made a lot of contingencies over the years, including ones for when I expect to have my memories edited against my will and want to send messages to my future self, Xvim said, surprising Zorian. That was quite paranoid. And also a good idea. He should probably make his own version of that. You will have to memorize the whole thing perfectly for this to work. If even a single number or letter is out of place, the whole thing is ruined. Zorian took several seconds to commit the code to his memory and then immediately created a memory packet around it, permanently preserving it for flawless recall in the future. Done, he said, handing the slip of paper back to Xvim. What now? Based on the various adventure novels Zorian had read as a child, he kind of expected Xvim to promptly burn the paper slip in his hand to prevent it from coming into the wrong hands. But no, Xvim just put it back into his pocket and gave Zorian a searching look. Disappointing. That, Mr. Kaczynski, is something that I should be asking you, Xvim said. I was originally worried that you might be an imposter and that you might have been editing my memories. Regardless of whether or not you really are a time traveler, you have effectively put those fears to rest. Truthfully, I have no right to demand anything more from you. What now, indeed? Well, you are technically my mentor and you're supposed to advise me about how to develop my magic, Zorian tried, hoping that Xvim would actually do his job properly for once. He was curious how Xvim's teaching looked when he was not putting his charges through some messed-up dedication test. Unfortunately, this is probably not the best time for that. I would need to thoroughly test your skills to see how I can best help you, and I've kept you away from your morning classes for too long as it is, said Xvim. I should have something ready for you when we meet again on Friday. Not another batch of shaping exercises, I hope? Zorian couldn't help but asking. No, Xvim said, smiling slightly at the question. While I definitely intend to correct any obvious deficiencies in your magic base and raise your shaping skills to acceptable levels, I'm actually thinking of advancing your dimensionalism studies as far as they can go. That is, after all, the magical field that deals with things like time manipulation, which makes it uniquely relevant to your situation. It is a hard and demanding field of study, but if you could endure several years of my trials and keep coming, you doubtlessly have the required patience to succeed at it. Huh? That actually sounded kind of nice. The first part sounded a little ominous, but he would reserve judgment until he actually saw what that entailed in practice. He didn't actually mind the idea of being taught some shaping exercises, so long as Xvim didn't resort to the same frustrating grin that he had employed in the past, and actually explained to Zorian how he was supposed to go about performing the exercise. In any case, the meeting was very much finished at this point, so Zorian said his goodbyes and left Xvim's office. It was probably the first time he had ever left that place feeling better than he had when he entered it. Break. Over the next few days, the after effect of Zorian's failed campaign against the burning Apex Web gradually faded away, leaving him completely healed. Kale was still poring over his necromancy books and tinkering with some kind of spell item he was building, and refused to talk to Zorian about Sadamir. He claimed he was pursuing a lead and that he would discuss things with him when he was ready. Zorian had a feeling that Kale was a little annoyed with him over his handling of the Soul Trap reveal, but he really couldn't think of what he could have done so much better. Maybe Kale didn't like that Zorian had waited so long to break the news to him? On the other hand, Taven had reacted much better when he had told her about the time loop this time. She was a lot more receptive to the idea if he didn't wait for her to have a breakdown before telling her. All in all, the recovery period was a bit boring and Zorian found himself searching for something to pass the time with. Just for fun, he recreated Kirill's drawings that he had stored in his mind and showed them to her. She frowned a lot while inspecting them, especially at the ones that clearly depicted the interior of Amaya's house and its inhabitants, but she did not seem willing to claim them as her own work. Instead, she criticized the technique of whoever drew them and suggested improvement, which amused him. She then asked him where he got them, and was annoyed at him when he insisted that he conjured them fully formed out of his head, which was also amusing. Somehow, the resulting argument led to Kirill giving him an impromptu drawing lesson and Zorian was bored enough at the time to go along with it. According to Kirill, he was actually decent at drawing, which surprised him. She even claimed he could get as good as she was if he was willing to work on it. Considering how swamped with everything he always was, he doubted he would ever find the time for something like that. Then again, perhaps he could use an actual hobby. It was during one of those slow days that Zorian went to the Academy library in search of a book that talked about Eldamar's internal politics. Partly because he couldn't shake off the feeling that Sadamir's offhand comment about how he was working with the invaders because of politics wasn't completely false, and partly because his recent musings about House Reed made him realize just how rudimentary his knowledge about Eldamar's power structures really was. He doubted he would really find an answer as to what Sadamir was referring to, but it probably wouldn't hurt to educate himself a little on the issue. In theory, Eldamar's internal situation was relatively simple. The country was a monarchy, with the power of the crown kept in check by a council of elders, a gathering of nobles that were ostensibly supposed to advise the monarch and help them govern the country efficiently. The seats were hereditary, each held by a different noble house. That was why they were noble. They had a seat on the Council of Elders, and were thus involved in the direct governing of the country. A regular house, while usually afforded a fair amount of special privileges and autonomy, did not have a say in how the country as a whole was run. Of course, reality was far more convoluted than that. The Crown and the Council of Elders clashed all the time. The houses routinely overstepped their bounds if they thought they could get away with it. Organizations like the Mage Guild and the Holy Triumvirate Church wielded considerable influence of their own, and powerful independent actors tried to play all sides for their own benefit. And that was not even getting into the issue of semi-autonomous entities like the Shifter tribes or the Freeport of Luya. Basically, the matter was complicated and Zorian's initiative didn't accomplish all that much. He was just about to give up and go home when he stumbled upon Tanami. Or rather, she stumbled upon him. He was stationary, with his back turned to her, and the only reason he knew she was there was that he could recognize her mind through long exposure to her during previous restarts. He was content to ignore her at first, pretending he didn't know she was there. But since she was sufficiently curious to look over his shoulder to see what he was reading, he decided to say hello in the end. "Hello, Tanami," he said, not bothering to turn around. She immediately jerked back in surprise at the words. "Ha! Surprise successful. Taking care to wipe the smile off his face, Zorian turned around to face the girl. It was only polite to look at someone when you were talking to them, after all. Is there something I can help you with? And no, sorry, she said, stumbling for a moment but recovering her composure quickly. I was just curious about what you were reading. And I just have to ask, Splinter of Splinters? Really, Zorian? That's kind of. She paused for a moment, clearly searching for a polite term to use. Why would you ever read such trash? She finished eventually. Zorian looked at the book in his hands. He hadn't noticed anything too bad in the book thus far, though admittedly he wouldn't call it good, either. Frankly, the only reason he was idly reading through it was because one of the other books he had already read and liked listed it among its sources. I'm trying to find out an answer to a political question, but I know very little about politics, Zorian answered honestly. So I'm mostly just reading things at random, leafing through whatever book catches my attention. He placed Splinter of Splinters back on the shelf. The book was boring as hell anyway. What kind of topic are you looking for? Tanami asked him. I'm trying to find out a political reason why someone would want to burn Sioria to the ground, Zorian told her bluntly. Hypothetically speaking, of course. Are we talking about external or internal forces? Tanami asked, completely unperturbed by his admission. Internal, Zorian clarified. I'm pretty sure the number of external enemies that want the same is numberless. Not really, no, Tanami said. Sioria supplies critical products to the entire continent. I think only Salamnon and a handful of others would be glad to see it completely gone. What about Ulquanabasa? Asked Zorian curiously. Them? Tanami scoffed. Who cares what they want? They can't do anything to us except radar shipping. And as long as Eldamar controls Fort Oriclo, even that is just a minor nuisance. Zorian hummed noncommittedly. He couldn't really fault Tanami for that logic, since he would have likely said something similar before he had experienced the invasion and found out who was behind it. Fair enough, he said. So what I'm getting from all of this is that you know a thing or two about politics, yes? I am an heir of one of the noble houses, Tanami shrugged. I'm required to know this sort of stuff. So yes, I suppose I do. Excellent. Then, do you think you can recommend me a book about Eldamar's internal politics that isn't trash, as you say? He asked her. He expected her to either say no or give him a title or two to look for. What he did not expect was for her to drag him across the library for over 15 minutes in search of something that met his exact criteria. By the time Tanami was done suggesting things to him, he had ended up with 3 different books, one of which was a huge scary tome that made Zorian sleepy just looking at it. He was starting to think he had made just a tiny bit of a mistake when he had asked her for help in this matter. Sorry, I went a little overboard, Tanami apologized, sounding honestly apologetic. It's fine, Zorian sighed. Though I'll be honest with you, I really doubt I'm going to read all of this. He shook the stack of books in his hands for emphasis. If you must pick one of the 3 to read, read Time of Tribulations, Tanami told him. Oh good, that wasn't the big one. That's the important one. The Splinter Wars and the Weeping completely rearranged the political landscape everywhere in Altasia, but especially in Eldamar. Without understanding what aftershocks they caused and how countries dealt with them, you will never really understand Eldamar's politics. I see, Zorian said quietly. That did make a lot of sense. The Splinter Wars essentially created Eldamar in its current form, and the Weeping actually originated from Eldamar. Nobody at the time realized just how dangerous it was, in the early days of its spread, so it had significant effects on the country. It would be surprising if those 2 events hadn't changed things greatly. I guess it has something to do with the significant death toll of mages those 2 caused. Sort of, Tanami said. It has to do with replacing them. Before the Splinter Wars, far more mages belonged to an established house or had at least one witch parent. First-generation mages like yourself were, well, not rare exactly, but far less common than they are now. After the Splinter Wars and the Weeping, Though, a lot of those houses and families went extinct or bankrupt, unable to deal with the chaos of the times or the loss of critical members. The last thing Eldamar wanted to do was downscale their operations due to lack of mages, so somebody had to replace the dead. The result was a lot of first-generation mages flooding the magical market in previously unseen numbers. So? Zorian asked. I guess I'm a little biased, being a civilian-born student myself. But why is that a problem? Not a problem as such, no, Tanami said carefully. But it definitely changed the politics of the country beyond recognition. First-generation mages are educated and supported by the Mage Guild, and by extension the Crown of Eldamar. When houses and other autonomous groups clash with the Crown, first-generation mages overwhelmingly side with the Crown. The influx of civilian-born mages helped Eldamar bounce back from the Splinter Wars and weeping incredibly quickly, but it also strengthened royal power and made the Mage Guild far more important than it used to be, and that scares a lot of factions. Interesting, Zorian hummed thoughtfully. How does that relate to Cioria and people who want to see it burn, though? Well, Cioria is absolutely critical for first-generation mages who want to make it big, Tanami said. Most other mana wells have sharp limits on the amount of mana they produce, and thus have tight regulations about who can perform what magical business in the area. They are usually controlled by some established group or even a house, and aren't very friendly to newcomers unless they are willing to become someone's underlings. The whole, on the other hand, spews incomprehensibly vast amounts of mana into the air every single second. Far more than anyone could really use up. There's never a shortage of ambient mana in Cioria, so nobody cares about how many mana forges, research facilities, and various other facilities are built in the city. Unsurprisingly, the city is absolutely flooded with first-generation mages, which makes it a major loyalist stronghold. It's so important to the central government, politically speaking, that some people call it the second national capital. Anyone who has an axe to grind against either the Crown or the Mage Guild might want to see it gone. Though I rather suspect that anyone expressing the desire to see it literally burned to the ground is just being overdramatic. Our external political situation is sufficiently dangerous that no one really wants to weaken the nation too much, and Cioria is both a major population center and a magical powerhouse. So, what I'm getting from your explanation is that people who most want to see Cioria gone probably come from various houses that dislike their historical importance being eroded, Zorian said. Sadly, that didn't explain Sadamir's remark as far as Zorian could tell. He had no idea whether Sadamir was a first-generation mage, but he definitely wasn't a part of the house. But the thing is, there are plenty of houses, even noble houses, who have their headquarters stationed here. Yours, for example. Or House Nevada. Not every house likes every other, Tanami shrugged. There are plenty of them that would hold a celebration if every op spontaneously died in their sleep. Ouch. But it's funny you would mention the Days. You know what happened to them, right? They all died except Zack, Zorian said immediately. Yes, and then the Crown placed Tizansveri as Zack's caretaker, and he sold off nearly everything they owned to his friends and associates for pocket change while paying himself a huge caretaker fee. Few people will outright say so, but the man basically looted the entire house of everything they had. And the Nevada were very, very wealthy, Tanami explained. If Zack wasn't such an idiot, I'd imagine he'd be extremely bitter about the city authorities that were complicit in the deed. I could totally imagine myself wishing for Cioria to burn down to ashes, if I were in his place. At least on an emotional level. Huh? You know, Zorian said. I think I want to hear more about that story. Chapter 050 Containment. The idea that Tizansveri had been stealing from Zack was not entirely surprising to Zorian. For one thing, he'd known for quite a while that Zack and Tizan did not get along, what with Zack occasionally thrashing the man at the beginning of the restart for no apparent reason. For another, Zack had explicitly told Zorian in one of the restarts that he did not approve of how Tizan had been managing his properties. It did not take some great genius to see that this was more than just a simple difference in opinion. Theft was one of several explanations that Zorian had considered as a possible explanation, but he could never quite figure out why Tizen would risk his reputation for what was surely just pocket change to someone of his stature. As it turned out, Zorian had been thinking too small. Tizen wasn't siphoning some money off the Navdace accounts here and there, he just plain went after everything they had. Surprisingly brazen. What kind of forces stood behind Tizen that would allow him to be so shameless about abusing the trust he was given? What kind of machinations and political maneuvering had compelled the royal family to assign such a hostile caretaker to the last surviving member of a house that had been so loyal to them in the past? All in all, when Zorian had asked Tanami to tell him more about Zack's caretaker and his looting of House Nevada's properties, he had expected quite a story. Something lengthy, complex and dramatic. What he got instead was a rather underwhelming tale of simple greed and corruption. The appointment of Tizen's Very to the position of Zack's caretaker was completely devoid of controversy at the time the decision was made. Tizen's Very was the patriarch of noble House Very, who had been close allies of House Nevada, and his reputation had been quite good at the time. Thus, when Tizen nominated himself for the position of Zack's caretaker, few people had any objections. He was a high-ranking nobleman, a powerful mage and an ally of the house that he was supposed to care for. Who could really contest his appointment? Unfortunately, Tizen's greed turned out to be stronger than his sense of obligation or respect for his deceased allies. From the moment he had acquired the rights to manage the Navdace property, Tizen wasted no time in abusing them as much as possible. Most of their property ended up being sold to members of houses very at laughably low prices, and the profits made from those sales largely went to Tizen himself in the form of exorbitant caretaker fees that he paid himself for doing such a fine job at managing things. And nobody protested about that. Zorian asked incredulously. The Crown? I heard House Nevada were big allies of the royal family. Or one of the Navdace's many vassal families and contractors. They must have had some power, and they surely couldn't have liked what Tizen was doing. Or hell, other noble houses, at least some of them must have felt sympathetic to Zack's cause. House Nevada was indeed a close ally of the Crown, Tanami confirmed. But so is House Very. And unlike noble House Nevada, noble House Very survived the upheavals largely intact. For the Crown to go after Tizen would have meant alienating one of their major remaining allies at a time where they could ill afford to do so. I suspect the Crown was unpleasantly surprised by Tizen's behavior, but decided to look the other way out of practicality. She paused for a second, frowning slightly as she considered things. Plus, I hear Tizen generously donated some of the artifacts and funds from the Navdace treasury to the Crown, she eventually continued. Actually, he was rather generous about spreading the Navdace wealth around in general. I imagine that's how he quieted most of the criticism. I see, Zorian hummed thoughtfully. They have their slice of the pie, so now they are no longer inclined to protest too much. Still, if Tizen had been as blatant about things as you said, you'd think that somebody would have tried to do something. Some people just don't care about money. Or at least not enough to let something like this go unchallenged. Ah, well, I make it sound really obvious but it's really not, Tanami said. The truth is that Tizen was always going to end up selling off a lot of Nevada properties and halting many of their activities, even if he had been acting in good faith. The problem was more about who he sold things to and at what prices. He was supposed to slim down noble House Nevada to a strong, manageable core. Instead, he used virtually all of their wealth to enrich his family and further his political career, leaving only a tiny sliver to Zack. But that's not something that is immediately obvious to casual inspection. You would have to launch an investigation into the matter to prove anything, and that would give Tizen plenty of time to mobilize his connections and shut you down before you get anywhere. Well, if it actually took some digging to realize what Tizen had done, then that would certainly help explain some things. Such as why none of their other classmates seemed to know about Zack's situation. Most of them were terrible gossips, so if Zack's situation was widely known, Zorian would have known about it too by now. Though really, considering how readily Tanami was telling him all this, he wondered how it was possible that she had never told this to the rest of their class. He decided to just ask her about it. "Well, if we were having this talk a year ago or so, I wouldn't have told you all this," Tanami told him. "Back then we had Zach in our class, and I wouldn't have wanted to say anything before talking to Zach about it. But now Zach is no longer in our class, so it doesn't matter anymore." "Ah, yes, since Zach fled Seoria at the beginning of the restart, just like he always did in recent restarts, it made sense to assume he had given up on the academy. His poor showing during their first 2 years of education probably made the theory even more plausible than it would otherwise be. He wondered whether Zach had known what Tizen had done to his inheritance before the time loop. He had a hunch the answer was no, since nothing about Zach's pre-loop attitude indicated that he was in any way concerned about his future or angry at his guardian, but he could be wrong. Maybe Zach was a very good actor. "How much do you think Zach knows about all of this?" Zorian asked Tanami. "I don't know," she said. "I only tried to sound him out once, and I guess I was too oblique because he thought I was hitting on him." Zorian couldn't help it. He laughed. "It's not funny," she protested. After several more minutes of questions and answers, Zorian found out that Tanami couldn't really give him any details about Zach's situation. She knew about the situation in general terms, but the specifics were understandably hard to come by. The conversation did, however, give Zorian an idea. What if Zach wasn't the only one that had happened to? "Oh yes, that sort of thing is not exactly a rare occurrence," Tanami said when he shared the notion with her. "A lot of weakened houses in smaller families ended up being dismembered like that in the aftermath of the Splinter Wars and the Weeping. Most countries had too many things on their plate to go after every shady thing that was happening, especially if the people doing the dismembering were closely aligned with the government or some other powerful faction. In fact, compared to the fates of some others, Zach is fairly lucky. Some of them were quite literally looted of everything they had. Once their caretakers were done with their properties, they were basically thrown out on the streets with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The Navdays are still a noble house though, so Tizen couldn't really go that far. He needed to have some smokescreen in case someone started throwing accusations. So Zach still has his mansion and can live off a healthy trust fund, and Tizen can point that if somebody tries to charge him with anything. Interesting. Zorian highly doubted that Zach wanted to see Seoria burned to the ground just because the city's leadership was complicit in the looting of his house. The other boy seemed too good-natured for that, but he could totally imagine some of the other, less fortunate and thus less forgiving individuals wanting to strike back at the people who had profited at their expense. No matter who'd get caught in the crossfire. Could Red Robe be one of the people in that position? That would help explain why the other time traveler seemed to want Seoria destroyed so badly. Well, he had no way to confirm that, so that would remain just an idle thought for now. Though, once he opened the matriarch's memory packet, he should probably try to track down those kinds of people living in Seoria and check up on them. Just in case. His talk with Tanami did not last long after that. They both had things they needed to be doing, and he was getting the impression that Tanami was starting to get a little suspicious of Zorian's fixation on the topic. Surprisingly, she wanted to meet with him again. Or maybe not so surprisingly, since she implied she wanted to ask a favor of him. After agreeing to another meeting, Zorian said goodbye to the girl and went back home. The moment he arrived back at the house, he realized he had stepped into pandemonium. Break. After coming back to Imaya's place, he found that Kopriva had dropped by and brought the alchemical ingredients Kale had asked for. Normally that would be excellent news, but it turned out that her timing had been somewhat unfortunate. She wasn't the only person to have dropped by at Imaya's house that day. Ri and Nachka had also decided to come over, Nachka so she could play with Kirill, and Ri so she could have a drink and chat with Imaya. Then, Taven arrived as well, wanting to discuss something with Kale. Thus, when Kopriva had come over to deliver the package, Kale was locked in his basement with Taven and Imaya was busy talking to Ri. The job of letting Kopriva into the house fell to the three remaining inhabitants of the house, Kirill, Nachka and Kana. Kopriva had already met Kirill, but not Kana. Kale didn't want their classmates to know he had a daughter, so he had kept her out of sight the last time Kopriva had come over. But Kale wasn't there, and Kirill couldn't keep a secret if her life depended on it, so when Kopriva asked Kirill to introduce her friends, she thought nothing of revealing Kenna's true identity. At that point the rest of the household got involved, with Kale freaking out and trying to convince Kopriva to keep Kenna's existence a secret, Kirill repeatedly trying to apologize to Kale, Kopriva being visibly amused, and Amaya trying to run damage control. Amusingly, it turned out that Taven hadn't known Kenna was Kale's daughter either. She just sort of assumed she was Amaya's daughter, despite her having the same sort of vivid blue eyes that her father had, and never sought confirmation about it from anyone. Sadly, everyone was too caught up in the drama to pay attention to the packet of alchemical ingredients that Kopriva had brought over. Well, everyone except Nachka. She decided that this mysterious packet was very interesting and worthy of examination. Unfortunately, either Kopriva had failed to secure the ingredients properly or Nachka had examined the package too enthusiastically, because she managed to breathe in a bit of hallucinogenic dust from the package and started losing control over her form. Her eyes became slitted like a cat, she grew a tail and claws and started hissing at people who tried to examine her to see what was wrong. That started the second round of drama, with Ree being upset that her daughter was basically outed as a shifter and that Kopriva had left dangerous substances within reach of children, Kopriva trying to defend herself, Kirill assuring Ree that it's okay because she already knew her friend can turn into a kitty, Ree being angry at Nachka for being so indiscreet, and poor Amaya playing peacemaker for the second time that day. At this point Zorian had come back from his talk with Tanami and was told what happened in his absence. "I was only gone for a couple of hours," Zorian complained. "Damn, you people work fast." He was immediately faced with a plethora of unamused looks. "Okay, look," he said placatingly. "I think you're all making mountains out of molehills here. First of all, I'm pretty sure Kopriva has no intentions of spreading rumors about Kenna amongst the student body. Mostly because he'd read her mind to make sure. And I don't think anybody here really minds Ree and Nachka being shifters, either. What makes you think I'm a shifter as well? She could have inherited it from her father for all you know," Ree protested, folding her hands over her chest. Zorian ignored her remark. "Really? The only semi-serious issue was that Nachka ended up drugged," said Zorian. "I swear I secured the package properly," Kopriva mumbled. "Nachka probably punctured something with her claws," Ree admitted with a sigh. "She likes to use her claws to remove wrappings and such. Nevertheless, the package was here because of me. And Kale, but that's beside the point. The point is, I feel somewhat responsible for what happened. What do you think would be an appropriate compensation for this?" "Oh, there is no need," began Ree, only to get cut off by her own daughter. "I want a doll," Nachka slurred. The effects of the alchemical dust she breathed had faded, but were still far from gone. "Like the one Kiri has." She said. "You made it." "I made a doll for Kiri?" Zorian asked, before he realized what Nachka was referring to. "Oh wait, you mean Kostjenka. That's technically not a doll, but whatever. Assuming your mother agrees, I don't see the problem with that. Is this doll going to explode if treated roughly?" Ree asked suspiciously. Not an unreasonable fear. Some magical items held a substantial amount of mana inside of them and could thus easily detonate if handled roughly. In this particular case, though, that would never happen. He didn't trust Kirill around explosives any more than Ree trusted Nachka around the same. "No, it will just stop being animated," Zorian said. "The golem is powered by ambient mana and made mostly out of wood, so there is nothing in there that could explode if it breaks." "Then no, I have no objections," Ree shrugged. "Though really, this is quite unnecessary. Nachka is just milking this for all it's worth, and I wouldn't blame you at all for simply telling her off." "Mom," Nachka whined. "You're supposed to be on my side." Zorian was distracted from the spectacle by a burst of emotion coming from Kenna. The little girl was fidgeting like crazy in Kale's lap, clearly waging some internal war with herself. Though she was as silent as ever, Zorian could feel through his empathy that her attention was squarely on him. She wanted to tell him something. "Let me guess, you want a doll too?" Zorian said, taking a wild guess at what was bothering her. Kana nodded so fast her head looked like it was going to fall off. A round of laughter from everyone present followed an exchange. All right, Zorian sighed. "I get it. 2 new golem dolls coming up. I'll be busy in the near future, but they should be done over the weekend." Now that he thought about it a little bit, this sort of development wasn't that surprising. Kirill had been making both girls jealous of her new toys for a whole week now, so it made sense that they'd want one of their own if they thought they could get away with it. They were probably just too polite to ask for one in previous restarts, or simply couldn't think of a good way to ask. "Damn it, now I'm getting a little jealous," Kopriva groused. "Why don't I get a doll too?" "You're too old to play with dolls," Zorian told her, rolling his eyes. "You can play with Kuzhenka when you visit," Kirill offered. "Oh," Kopriva grinned, ruffling Kirill's hair. "You're a sweet kid. It's hard to believe you're related to someone like Zorian." "Hey, brother is really great," Kirill protested, pushing Kopriva's hand away from her hair so she could straighten it back into place. "He's like a hedgehog. He gets nice once you get past his prickliness." Ugh. And they were just getting started, too. After completely defusing a tense situation and promising to make expensive toys for a couple of little girls? Truly no good deed goes unpunished. Friday came, and with it Zorian's next meeting with Xvim. This time, however, Xvim didn't want to hold their session inside his office. Instead, he led Zorian to a restricted training ground he had reserved for the day. They would be doing serious magic, Xvim claimed, so his office was no longer sufficient for their purposes. "I have talked to some astronomers since we last met," Xvim began, unlocking the door of the training ground and shooing him inside. "I have nothing conclusive yet, but the results thus far are not encouraging. There have been no significant deviations among the celestial bodies. Additionally, the planets in particular are being closely watched because of the upcoming planetary alignment. It is unlikely they are illusionary. The affected area likely includes the entire solar system. Provided it is, in fact, limited by area," Zorian pointed out. "Yes," Xvim agreed easily. "That is true. However, while my forays into astronomy have met with rather disappointing results, I found something interesting while researching time magic. Tell me, have you ever heard of black rooms?" "What, the ones that let you spend several years inside while only a day passes outside? Those actually exist?" Zorian asked incredulously. "No, those ones are definitely fake," Xvim said, shaking his head. "But ones that can stretch a day into a month do. And the interesting thing is how they achieve that kind of extreme time dilation effect. Time magic has sharp limits in how effective it can get. Even the most powerful hasting effects can only speed up time 4 to 5 times before they hit a wall. At that point, no matter how powerful and skillful the image is, the boundary between two temporal flows starts to unravel. So how can black rooms speed up time by a factor of 30, then?" Zorian frowned. "By isolating them from the rest of the world," Xvim said. "That's why they're called black rooms. They have to completely enclose the area and seal it off. This greatly lessens the stress of the temporal boundary, but it also makes it impossible to interact with people outside while the black room is working. Once the time dilation is engaged, nothing goes in or out until the effect is broken. Material supplies, magical communication. Nothing goes through. Even contact with the spiritual planes is blocked." Zorian frowned. "I see. So there is precedence for powerful time magic to require an enclosed area to function properly. But from what I understand, the principles behind the black rooms would require the affected area to be literally enclosed in a physical box. The time loop is clearly a more advanced piece of magic than the black rooms, so it's likely it uses a more subtle method of sealing off the area of effect," Xvim responded. "I suppose," Zorian said, acknowledging the possibility. "I'm curious, though, how come black rooms are such a mystery?" I only knew of them as rumors up until this point. Surely Aldemar would not hesitate to use them openly if they are so effective? In addition to needing tremendous amounts of mana, black rooms are very difficult to use properly, Xvim said. Due to the way they are cut off from the outside, one has to plan each use very carefully. If the organizers fail to account for something critical, the whole operation is essentially ruined, and a lot of time and mana has been wasted. Black rooms cannot be turned off and on at will, and the mana cost of an operation has to be paid in full at the start. I understand there is a lot of controversy surrounding the black rooms, with many people disputing their actual usefulness and claiming they are a huge waste of money. Some of the more spectacular failures associated with them do not help their reputation. Oh? Zorian asked, intrigued. Initially, black rooms could not prematurely terminate the time dilation field once it was turned on, said Xvim. Once the black room was on, whoever was inside was stuck until the spell wore off. Zorian winced. Yeah, that had been bound to end poorly. At least one group died of thirst after an administrative mix-up caused the organizers to stockpile too little water into the area before activation. Another group almost died of starvation after some form of insect snuck into the food supply and managed to ruin most of it before the infestation was detected. Even if everything was done properly, you are still essentially imprisoning several people in a small, cramped space where they have no privacy and little to entertain themselves with. Fights were common, with several experiments culminating in a bloodbath. In one memorable case, the entire group managed to mutually kill each other off. There were literally no survivors once the black room finally opened. What about sending individuals? Zorian asked. Most people can't handle total isolation for long, Xvim shook his head. Besides, it costs exactly the same to run a black room for one person as it does for several of them, and the more people you send in, the more work can get done. After that, Xvim asked Zorian to demonstrate some of his flashier magic, mostly combat magic and landscape alterations, but also teleportation, which actually worked unimpeded within the training ground, unlike in most of Sioria. It made sense, considering Xvim had told him during their last meeting that he intended to teach him dimensionalism. After a while, his mentor decided he'd seen enough and motioned him to stop. You seem to have no specialty that I can see, Xvim said. Well, I guess my specialty are spell formulas, said Zorian. But that is not exactly something I can demonstrate quickly and at whim. Just as well, Xvim said. I know comparatively little about spell formulas and would be ill-equipped to evaluate your skill in the field. Wait, Xvim actually didn't have expertise in something related to magic? Some of Zorian's amusement and surprise at the notion must have shown on his face because Xvim actually decided to provide an explanation. I understand why so many mages are fascinated with spell formula, but I always found them to be somewhat distasteful myself, Xvim said. They are a crutch, most of the time. With a proper mastery of a spell, you wouldn't need them. Right? Zorian scowled. He understood why someone obsessed with perfection in mana shaping would have low regard for magical aids that sidestep the need for that, but there was more to spell formula than making spell rods and such. I'm not criticizing you, Mr. Kaczynski, Xvim said. Just explaining my lack of interest in the discipline. You can go far if you really master your specialty. But enough of that. When I said you don't seem to have any specialty, I meant in regards to mana shaping fields. You seem to be a generalist when it comes to those, yes? I seek out whatever magic is relevant to me at the moment, said Zorian. But yes, in general I try to master a little bit of everything. As far as I can tell, the main reason people specialize is time constraints. I'm not quite immune to that, but I'm pretty sure I can get good at several fields instead of just one. The path of an archmage, Xvim nodded. I approve. For someone in your situation, aiming for anything less would have been a waste. I'm glad I don't have to convince you of that, at least. Huh? Did Xvim just praise him for something? In any case, this reminded him of something he had been wondering for quite a while. Are you an archmage? Zorian asked Xvim. An archmage is not an official rank that someone assigns to a person, Xvim said. It is simply a term for a mage who has mastered several fields of magic to such an extent that they could outdo a typical specialist mage when it comes to those fields. I suppose the term could be applied to me, but it would be shockingly arrogant of me to claim it on my own. One is only ever a real archmage when other people start referring to you as such, and not many people use that term to describe me. Then again, not many people know about me in the first place, and I prefer it that way. So that would be a yes, basically. Surprising that a person like that would be willing to work as a teacher at the academy. People like Xvim were incredibly rare and in high demand. Then again, Xvim did say he liked being an unknown, so perhaps a relatively quiet job like this one was just what he wanted. Do you have a specialty? Zorian asked. He figured that since Xvim was in a relatively good mood at the moment, he might as well milk it for all it's worth and try to find out more about the man. Defense against magical attacks of all sorts, Xvim said. I actually teach an advanced class on the topic in your 4th year of education. Of course, if one aims to defend against something, they must first get to know it. And thus, I have become familiar with many a type of magic. But let's get back to you, shall we? I have to say, for one aiming to become an archmage, your way of going about it is somewhat suboptimal. How so? Zorian frowned. For instance, your way of choosing which mana shaping exercises to practice, Xvim said. While practicing a wide selection of different exercises like you've been doing is certainly useful, it is not really the best avenue of approach for a generalist mage. You would have been better served by focusing on raw mana manipulation and sensing. Such basic shaping exercises are time-consuming and give no short-term benefits, but the cumulative effect of their mastery decreases the learning time of every spell and improves spellcasting in general. I haven't really heard about such shaping exercises, Zorian said, feeling a little lost. It's not something a specialist mage would care much for, Xvim said. And most people who write books are specialists. Your age works against you here. Most people don't start dabbling in those exercises until they're much older, no matter how talented they are. So the people you spoke to probably didn't think you'd be interested in those. Young mages like you have plenty of low-hanging fruit with much faster payoff to amuse themselves with. Right. So what are we talking here exactly? Zorian asked. I'm drawing a blank as to what sort of raw mana manipulation I could be doing as an exercise. Well, one major deficiency I noticed in your skills is that you don't seem to perceive mana around you to any appreciable extent, Xvim said. And I'm guessing your ability to perceive your personal mana flow is hardly any better than that of the rest of your classmates. For someone of biological age, that would be entirely adequate, if rather disappointing. In your case, it really is inexcusable. Zorian was tempted to ask whether it was inexcusable by Xvim's standards or the more sane standards of the rest of the world. But he didn't. This was absolutely fascinating, and he had largely gone numb to Xvim's barbs by now. From everything I've read, mana sensing is a rather advanced skill that even long-time mages struggle with. Yes, but you seem to be rather bad at it, even accounting for that, Xvim noted. I'm guessing this is a consequence of spending so many years in Sioria, which is awash in ambient mana. It's good for training, certainly, but it instills a certain amount of wastefulness in young mages. Zorian didn't need empathy to notice the distaste on Xvim's face when he said that. On top of that, it is very difficult to practice perception exercises in a place like this, Xvim continued. The ambient mana suffuses everything, dulling your senses. It would be far better to practice mana sensing somewhere outside the city to start with. This training ground is specially warded to keep the majority of the ambient mana out of it. Did you notice that? No, Zorian admitted with a frown. Though now that Xvim mentioned it. This is what I meant when I said your ability to sense mana is deficient, Xvim said. You should have noticed it right away, the moment you stepped into the training ground. But no matter, that's why I'm here, to help you overcome your many flaws and become the best you can be. In any case, while the exercises I'm about to teach you would be normally rather hard to practice outside of this training ground, you are capable of teleportation. I suggest you simply teleport into the countryside outside of the city when you want to work on your ability to sense mana. Now pay close attention to what I'm about to do. Break. At the end of the session, Zorian was honestly feeling a little overwhelmed by Xvim's program. While the man was less of an asshole in this restart, he was still a very demanding teacher who pulled no punches when he seriously taught people. He had ended up showing Zorian more than 20 exercises aimed at improving his ability to sense mana, both inside and outside of him, and he expected Zorian to work on them for several hours every single day. On top of that, Xvim also showed him several exotic teleportation variants that Zorian was also expected to learn by their next meeting, and gave him a deceptively simple shaping exercise related to dimensionalism. The exercise involved taking a random rock and trying to form a so-called dimensional boundary around it. Apparently, the formation of such a boundary was the first step in just about every piece of magic dealing with time and space. The teleportation spells he loved using so much formed a boundary like that around him every time he used them, and would fail instantly if something prevented the spell from creating it. Like a ward, for instance. Getting better at shaping the boundary could easily improve just about every dimensionalism spell he cared to cast in the future. The problem was that the dimensional boundary was completely invisible to normal senses, making the exercise really hard to practice. How do you create and shape something you can't see and can only vaguely feel via crude feedback your personal mana gives you? He didn't think he could get the hang of that exercise anytime soon. Of course, if his ability to sense mana, especially his personal mana, was on a higher level, the exercise would have instantly gotten a lot easier. Zorian was pretty sure Xvim had only given him that exercise to drive the point home how important mana sensing was and how much his lack of skill there was holding him back. Ugh. Days went by quickly. Kale was still working on the Sadamir problem, but Zorian had plenty of things to hold his time, so he left his Morlock friend in peace. His attacks on Arania webs were restarted, though this time he was less ambitious and picked a bunch of minor webs instead of a relative juggernaut like the Burning Apex. Accordingly, his attacks went a lot better and his Arania memory reading skills got lots and lots of practice. Since he was already rooting through the memories of defeated Aranias, he decided to kill two birds with one stone by searching their minds for interesting mind magic skills. He found nothing really revolutionary, but every minor trick and variation of a known technique he learned from his fallen foes added up to something in the end. He met with Tanami again, like he agreed to. Like she hinted at in their last meeting, she wanted to ask him for a favor. Specifically, she wanted him to give her his family tree. A weird request, but apparently she was collecting that information from all of her classmates for a personal project. His cynical side insisted that this was a code name for secret AOP information gathering operation, but who knew really? Maybe she was just really interested in people's lineages in addition to spiders. In any case, Zorian saw no reason not to humor her and promptly cobbled up something for her in his notebook. The execution was a bit lacking, unfortunately, since his knowledge of his family tree was a bit sketchy. Especially on his mother's side, since she hated talking about her witch mother and anything related to her. Tanami didn't care about how sketchy it was, though. If anything, she seemed to be even more excited about it when she found out Zorian had a witch among his ancestors. Considering the origin of Noble House AOP, he probably shouldn't be surprised about that. Despite the incident with Kapra's alchemical supplies, Ri kept coming to Imaya's home and bringing Nachka along with her. If anything, Ri's friendship with Imaya seemed to have only become firmer in the wake of revelations about her shifter nature. Meanwhile, Nachka and Kanu were proud owners of their own toy golems. Nachka had asked for her golem to be given a feminine form like Kasjenka's, and named it Rutvika, while Kanu was a bit of a surprise in that she wanted her toy golem to look male and have white hair. Zorian had no idea what she called it, but Kirill and Nachka seemed to have decided its name was Jaglenak amongst each other. In other news, Kana seemed to have realized that Zorian had some method of understanding her thoughts, because these days, whenever she wanted to have her desires known, she simply dragged him off from whatever he was doing so he could interpret for her. And here he'd thought she was a little angel. Turns out he just hadn't had anything she'd wanted up until now. Finally, as the end of the restart began to approach, Kale finally decided he'd run out of options. He asked Zorian to teleport him in the vicinity of Yasku Mansion so he could try to analyze the soul trap. He didn't think that would accomplish much, but there was little else he could think of. Zorian agreed, and decided to take Taven along with them. Mostly because he intended to try to analyze the soul trap himself, from the perspective of a spell formula specialist rather than a soul mage, and he needed someone to defend them against the Iron Beaks and Winter Wolves patrolling the wilderness around the place. Taven had no objections, and even relished the chance to fight something, so they were off. They only stayed a short while, and Zorian had to break off his analysis to help Taven defeat the flock of Iron Beaks that had started to harass them. But it was enough for Kale to decide the whole thing was beyond him. Kale was very quiet and subdued after that. The next day he'd made an excuse to drag Zorian out of the house and asked him to teleport them to the north of Nyazovt Valley so he could visit his wife's grave. "We're here," said Kale, pointing at the small abandoned cottage just ahead of them. Finally, Zorian mumbled, breathing heavily. He felt sorry for Kale, he really did. But when Kale said the place was not far from the main road, he didn't quite think the Morlock boy meant this. An hour-long trek, uphill, along a bumpy, narrow forest path was not what Zorian would describe as not far. Also, how the hell was Kale not affected in the slightest by the journey? The boy didn't look all that fit to him. Once they reached the cottage, Zorian took a minute to catch some breath and looked around. Kale immediately went to the back of the building to tend to the two simple, earthen graves that stood there. Pretty isolated place, Zorian noted, wandering over to help Kale get rid of the grass and weeds that had completely overrun the place. "No offense, but why did you end up burying your wife here, of all places?" "I didn't have much choice back then," Kale said. "There was only one village in the vicinity, and they're very backwards, superstitious folk. They'd never let a witch and her daughter get buried in their cemetery along with their own dead. And even if I could make them accept it somehow, they'd just vandalize it the moment I wasn't looking." "Disgusting," Zorian frowned. "It's fine," Kale said, shaking his head sadly. "This was their home. It somehow feels appropriate for them to be buried here." "So this other grave," began Zorian. "Freya," said Kale. "My mother-in-law, and also my teacher. She died just before Namura did." Namura, Zorian learned, was the name of Kale's deceased wife. The crude gravestones that Kale had presumably made for them said their last name was Dvorinov. Apparently Kale had assumed their family name when he married Namura. That was pretty interesting. It was not unheard of for a husband to take on his wife's name, but it did not happen very often. Usually only civilians who somehow managed to marry into one of the houses did that. Then again, maybe it was a witch thing. He knew that one of the reasons his mother and grandmother did not get along was that mother decided to take father's family name instead of the other way around. Considering that mother's choice seemed very conventional in the grand scheme of things, his grandmother's objections had always seemed strange to him. They both stood there in silence for a while, not saying anything. Finally, after several minutes of comfortable silence, Kale spoke. "I'm sorry," Kale said suddenly. "For what?" Zorian asked curiously. "I wasted your time," Kale sighed. "What?" Zorian asked incredulously. "You just wanted to visit your wife's grave. There is nothing wrong with that." "No, I'm talking about Sadamir and his soul trap," Kale said. "I kept stalling for over 2 weeks and I have nothing to show for it. I should have given up long ago, but—" "Ah," said Zorian. He'd kind of figured out that wasn't going anywhere after the first week or so. "It's fine, really. Are you sure there is nothing new you can tell me?" "Nothing," Kale said, shaking his head. He then reached out into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small notebook. He handed it to Zorian. "Here. I wrote down everything relevant I could think of into that notebook. Keep in mind that this is literally just me making wild speculations, though I have no way to know if anything I wrote there has any basis in reality." Right, said Zorian, pocketing it for the moment. There would be time to read it later. Still, even if it's just speculation, it's clearly not nothing. I guess, Kale said. But I still feel pretty useless. Why? Zorian asked curiously. He had known for a while that Kale was frustrated by his inability to offer help against Sadamir, but he never really understood why Kale felt so deeply about that. I don't know, admitted Kale. Maybe it reminds me of how Freya and Namora contracted the weeping, and I could do nothing except helplessly watch as they wasted away. Or maybe I'm overthinking things. I heard it's a bad idea to psychoanalyze oneself. Zorian couldn't help but wince visibly. Kale didn't often refer to his personal tragedy, so sometimes it was hard for Zorian to keep in mind how traumatic these deaths must have been for his Morlock friend. He had never lost anyone he personally cared about to the weeping, but he'd heard that those who felt the disease suffered horribly before the end. It was at times like this that Zorian really understood how the specter of that epidemic still hung over many people's lives. It had only been a handful of years since the weeping, after all, and many people were still mourning their dead. I hope you don't think less of me for asking this, said Zorian. But how did you end up as a married father at 13, anyway? Kale burst into laughter. What? He asked, greatly amused. All these restarts and you never thought to ask me this before? Well, I never seemed to find a good opening to. Zorian fumbled, caught off guard by the rapid change in Kale's demeanor. Sometimes, Zorian, you're just too considerate, Kale said, shaking his head with a final chuckle. I'd have asked by the end of the third restart for sure if I was in your place. And by the way, you're off by 2 years. I was actually 15 when I got Kana. Zorian gave him a strange look. I'm older than I look, Kale explained. I'm 2 years older than the rest of our class, but Elsa said that doesn't really matter. Huh? He'd never have guessed Kale was 2 years older than him. Anyway, Kale said. There is not much to say. My mother died in childbirth and my father resorted to alcoholism soon afterwards, so I learned to stay away from the house most of the time. The village children didn't want to associate with a Morlock, so I ended up wandering the wilderness a lot, looking for things to sell for extra cash. One day I stumbled upon Namora in the forest and she led me to this place to meet her mother. Eventually Freya found out about my situation and offered to take me in. I agreed, of course. What, you weren't scared away by rumors of witches making potions out of children's blood? Zorian asked jokingly. Well, the rumors also said Morlocks like me ate people, so I didn't put much stock in them, Kale said. Anyway, I soon found out that Freya's motives weren't entirely motivated by compassion. She wanted an heir, and Namora did not have much talent for magic. I thought witch magic was heavy on the potions and very light on anything that would require actual shaping skills? Asked Zorian. It is, confirmed Kale. And Namora was still horrid for it. She didn't have the instincts or the mentality for it. Since Freya really didn't want her secrets to die with her, she needed to teach her magic to someone from outside the family. And she chose me, because... well... Namora fancied you? Zorian guessed. Yes, Kale sighed. She actually made it an official condition for teaching. If I wanted her magic, I had to marry her daughter. But really, I'd have agreed to marry Namora even if she didn't provide any incentive for me to do so. Kale spent the next half an hour telling Zorian small, inconsequential stories about his life in the cottage next to them. It seemed to help his mood immensely. Finally, he took a deep breath and signaled to Zorian that they should go back to Imaya's place before the inhabitants got worried. I have made no mention of Sadamir's soul trap in my research journals, Kale said suddenly, just as they were about to leave. If I ever ask you about him or the disappearing soul mages in the area, just lie to me. Say you have no idea what is happening or something. It's not like I can do anything about it and it makes it completely impossible for me to focus on my work. I felt horrible these past few weeks, and I failed to get anything done on the alchemical side of things. Zorian stared at him for a second before nodding in agreement. Consider it done. Toad continued,